Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's 1 hour long webinar titled Chain Cybersecurity, How to Mitigate Third-Party Risks, sponsored by LRQA. Now, my name is Benjamin David, and I'm the Deputy Editor of Info Security Magazine, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Now, with supply chain transparency and digital transformation being among the top organizational priorities, cyber-related issues have become one of the top risks to businesses. Now, most companies don't consider their supply chain vulnerability when thinking about cybersecurity. Yet, supply chain risk could include multiple functions across the flow of information, products, and services, needing the attention of all entities involved. Supply chain security is every company's responsibility. Now, in this webinar, we will address the key cybersecurity third-party concerns and discuss the most effective tactics for organizations to secure their supply chains and contribute to global supply chain security. And we will also discuss how certification to ISO 27001 can support supply chain security, the changes to ISO 27002 controls, and how these controls relate to third-party cybersecurity. Now, also today's webinar will explore the common issues and key principles in managing cyber risk in your supply chain, the measures organizations can take to monitor, identify, assess, and mitigate third-party risks, ISO 27002 changes, and again, what these mean for ISO 27001 and your ISMS. And lastly, what are the controls in ISO 27001 that relate to the supply chain, and what do they mean for your business? Now, I'm happy to announce we have a fantastic supply range of speakers joining us to tackle this issue today. So firstly, we have Rob Acker, who's the ICT Technical Manager at LRQA. Now, Rob has over 35 years of experience in software development and information security management systems. Since 2007, he has served as ICT Technical Manager and QMS, ISMS, BCMS, and TIC IT Plus Lead Auditor for LRQA. We also have Nick Prescott, who's the Principal GRC Consultant, or VCSO, at Netitude. Now, Nick's primary engagement focus at Netitude is at the interim/VCSO level, advising companies on strategy, tactics, and operations to assist, advise, and fix security programs. His aim is to take a pragmatic and realistic approach to improve cybersecurity postures for businesses within the FTSE 100 or FTSE or small tech startups. And lastly, we have Christian Thun, who's CISO at Pinsent Masons, he has overall responsibility for cyber and information security across the practice. Now, Christian has almost 2 decades of experience in information protection strategy across a variety of organizations and geographies, including a large information management services company and a Big Four professional services firm. Thanks so much for all of you joining me today. Before we jump into the opening presentation or presentations, there are a few housekeeping points to address. Now, this webinar qualifies members of ISC Squared, EC Council, and ISACA for 1 CPE credit based on a minimum attendance time of 50 minutes. Now, to claim your credit, you will need to log in to your Info Security Magazine member account 48 hours after the session has been completed and download your CPE certificate, which will have been generated if you meet the minimum attendance time. You are then responsible for submitting this to your accreditation body. Now, of course, make sure to tweet using the hashtag InfoSecWebinar and pose questions to the panelists using the question function. Now, I want to kick off with an opening poll, if I may. So, and that question is, thinking about supplier performance, what are you most concerned about? So we have reputation, customer impact, management effort, business interruption, and legal/regulatory issues. So that poll is now launched. Do get voting. As mentioned, we have two opening presentations. The first presentation is by Nick. So Nick, I will pass over the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you very much for the warm introduction there. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about how we see third-party risks from a kind of VCSO perspective, and kind of really seeing what we're seeing within the market as well. So what we're going to do is just do a bit of scene setting, what we should be looking for in suppliers, and some kind of common footfalls that I've seen on my kind of consulting journey. So the supply chain is a complex web. For those of you who are information security managers or work within companies, there's a lot of time where you'll have people from your company coming to ask you to fill in security due diligence questionnaires, or if you're selling a product or a service to another company, they will probably do some security due diligence, but that will be part of a wider effort as well. But obviously, as the company gets bigger, as the supply chain gets more complex, there is a need to manage all the suppliers that are kind of supplying services to yourself as well. So essentially, it's a big web. Not only are you asking other people's questionnaires, you should be sending out questionnaires to other companies as well. So what is supply chain security? So it is what, why, how, where a third-party supplier could pose a threat to a company's information security posture, identifying the risk and potential impact on the company's cyber resilience, ascertaining the maturity, evaluating the effectiveness, and identifying and reporting gaps in the expected security controls. What's really important, it essentially, when you're sending out questionnaires to downstream, you're highlighting the security kind of gaps or events that you might find as part of your questioning. So why is this important? Well, over the years, it's been said that about 2/3 of all data breaches are done through supply chain security. And if you look at the really big ones that have happened, for example, probably the biggest one in recent memory was NotPetya, but there's also lots of other little ones that have happened. And basically what happens is that the bad guy puts a bit of a vulnerable code. He then puts it into the software vendor's client. And because there's a perceived trusted relationship between the main business and the supply chain, there's usually a kind of backdoor that goes in there. So when you remember the NotPetya, that was the Ukrainian government tax server. And what happened with that one was that it was done through an update, and that's why it caused so much of a mess, because it was a software update through a trusted vendor. So what is the best practice with the supply chain? Obviously, most people kind of send some form of kind of questionnaire. There's a kind of risk results and analysis using InfoSec staff for automated scoring. Then the risk kind of determination needs to be taken. The results of the survey should present the business with the impact and criticality indicators. And then from that, the InfoSec team or compliance team or due diligence team presents a set of actions, which basically means they either sustain, escalate the risk to the business, or in very small number of cases, kind of remove the supplier as well. But that takes a pretty big thing to do. So what is perceived best practice? There are lots of questionnaires out there, but if you're looking for a good one, so that's kind of SIG, the Standard Investigationnaire version 8 Lite. That is a pretty detailed questionnaire as well. You can use ISO 27001, you can use NIST SF, CIS 18, but there are loads of them out there. In fact, there is no kind of standard kind of security due diligence onboarding questionnaire out there. It's one of those kind of mysteries of the information security industry, is that every supplier questionnaire that you get seems to be slightly different, but they come in all shapes and sizes. They ask all different types of questions as well. So, the key thing is best practice is actually getting the supplier to answer the question. There are some questionnaires that are amazingly complex, require big project teams to answer, or they're just really high level and they're just asking some quite obscure questions. So there is no kind of global gold-plated standard. But again, a lot of them reference things like ISO 27001, 27002, NIST CIS 18, SIG, that kind of thing as well. So essentially, perceived best practice really is making sure that the supplier answers the questionnaire as quickly and efficiently and as effectively, and most importantly, as thoroughly as possible. So security questionnaires are not done in isolation. The reality is that when you're sending out security questions, if you think of kind of financial services, the KYC, anti-bribery and corruption, data privacy and protection. So, if you do have a security questionnaire, just be considerate that there could be a whole load of other ones. And the last thing that your supplier wants to be doing is answering the same question 5 times for 5 different departments. So what should we be looking for in the suppliers? So the key thing, the one thing we do when you kind of look at the PITS model, is how many staff are in there, what staff are in scope, where are those staff? I've seen instances where you've had software companies, and those software companies have contractors, and those contractors are in the OFAC list of banned countries, which just makes life really easy for everyone. Former Soviet states or Chinese states or whatever, they're supplying code to your supplier, and that code then comes into your network. So it has happened quite a lot, and it's not the stuff of Hollywood. The information there, what information they're processing. Are they processing your personal data, your sensitive data, your financial data? What information do they have their suppliers working on as well? Where are their office locations, where are their data centers, where's their IT equipment, what's their IT equipment on, and also what systems are they using? Are they still using, dare I say, Windows XP? Are they using embedded systems? Have you made sure the systems that they're using, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, it's kind of up to date, well patched, and that they've got good protective technologies in place as well. So again, what you need to kind of grade the suppliers, and that's kind of really important. Ones that have persistent access, sponsored access, or occasional or even infrequent access. So this is the kind of guide that we use is basically persistent access, is they've got as much access to your network as you have. They probably have admin accounts, and unless you are watching what they're doing the whole time, you don't know what they're doing. So essentially, these are the different levels you have there. One of the key challenges that we find in a lot of the businesses is actually making sure that they have a confirmed list of high and critical suppliers before they send these questionnaires. If they're just applying you teaspoons or coffee, you don't need to do an information security questionnaire on them. It doesn't need to go that far. It's all about getting the right level of suppliers in place. So again, this is another way of assessing the criticality of the suppliers, is making sure that you have the right kind of resilience that is built in place as well. So essentially, you'll have a decision to outsource the systems. You'll then have a selection of the service providers, and then you'll have some oversight and governance in place as well. So basically, you're selecting the supplier, doing all this, selecting the solution, where it's hosted and everything, and then basically making sure that you have good governance in place. So you might want to have an impact chart, something that looks a bit like this, and basically that helps you define your critical and high level supplier list. So again, I'm not going to go too much through this slide, but it is complex, and I'm sure the slides will be shared afterwards. But essentially, you're looking to basically create a questionnaire, send it to the supplier. The supplier receives the questionnaire, sends it back to the company. Then the internal teams look at the risk level. If that is accepted, then you kind of onboard them. If it's not, then you can escalate it to the company on a predefined risk level. then the company, the business owners, the data owners, the information owners, the application owners, whoever owns it, not necessarily information security, they can go and investigate it. If there's further analysis needed, then the InfoSec team can go back on site, and then basically the risk can be kind of accepted. If it's not accepted, then it's kind of recommended to terminate. But essentially, further questions done to the supplier, and then essentially you can kind of do the risk over and above the questionnaire. And this happens usually quite a lot as well. And then you have annual reassessments and stuff like that. So what are the common pitfalls that you have? The old school way of doing things was kind of send an email with an attached spreadsheet. It's more reliable than fax machines. They don't really happen anymore. But there is still a lot of dependency on sending an Excel spreadsheet. And the old school way of doing things is you then kind of have your spreadsheet, do a telephone-based interview, and then you kind of write up a report. It's all very time-consuming, and it can kind of create a lot of work for what is already an overstretched information security team. And then the real kind of pitfall of Excel, if you've got a small number of suppliers, it might work. But unless there's a good way of collating that risk, having automation in there, it can really get into this kind of really complex macros and algorithms and looking at risk and everything. So the key thing is making sure it is an effective and an efficient process as possible. So what are the actions from here is, I would say, automate the process as much as possible. Invest in a portal, use things like SharePoint, use things, there are loads of tools out there, I'm not going to explain to them. Get a good list of high and critical suppliers, assess the criticality of those suppliers, put a good risk benchmarking against those suppliers, and then do the analysis, the resilience of those suppliers and their supply chain as well. Making sure that you have a really good supplier security questionnaire. Make sure the questions get the right amount of information based on what your risk is. Agree and implement the workflow with your business owners, your data owners, your information owners, your application owners, because at the end of the day, you might kind of get a questionnaire back, look at it and go, oh my God, this is kind of worse than nuclear Armageddon. We need to dump the supplier, but essentially it could be a critical supplier that has a really high level of availability. It'd be a multi-year, multi-million pound project to replace that supply. It's not as easy as deleting the app on the iPad and loading up a new one. And make sure that you align policies and procedures and implement the process. But that's really done through the ISO 27001 side. And thank you very much. And from that, I think I will hand back over to Benjamin and put myself on mute. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. That was a really fascinating presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to explore more detail during the Q&A portion of the webinar. I want to get the results, actually, of that first poll that I launched. And as a quick reminder, a question is, thinking about supplier performance, what are you most concerned about? Some quite interesting results here. So 5% of you have gone with reputation. 35% of you, so the majority of you, have gone with B, so customer impact. 0% have gone with management effort. 32, so second place, have gone with business interruptions, so it's D. And lastly, with E, legal regulatory issues, 26% of you have voted for that. So thank you so much for voting. I'm going to launch the second poll of today's webinar. And that poll will be on the question, what is the biggest challenge in setting a supply chain agreement? So the options are defining suitable level of detail, understanding access requirements, understanding resilience requirements, understanding incident reporting requirements, and lastly, agreeing audit/monitoring requirements. So that poll is launched, so it's not live. Do get voting. And of course, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, do use that question functionality I mentioned earlier. Now, I'll pass it over for our second presentation before we jump into a Q&A. So I'll pass it over to Rob for your presentation.
Many thanks, Benjamin. And yeah, fascinating to see the results of the poll. I was watching it, and so business disruption always seemed to be leading until customer impact came in with a sort of a late bid. So interesting to hear from our viewers as to perhaps any clues as to why that slightly changed. What I was trying to do here is just draw, I suppose, attention to the new version of 27002, its implications for 27001 and certification, and make sure that we're all using it to help ourselves in managing the supply chain. Clearly, 27,000 series has a far wider remit than the supply chain, but I think there's a few new features that have come in with the new release that people may find interesting and helpful. So, by way of sort of setting the timeline, setting the scene for this change, so we saw the publication of the new version of 27002 back in February, and all the indications are that it'll be late this calendar year before we see the actual publication of the certification standard. That said, what do we think will be the major changes? Well, again, the indications are, and it's a testament to the popularity, shall we say, testament to the success of the information security model established around 27001, that we're not expecting any major changes to the core management processes, setting the context, understanding the risks involving leadership and implementing and improving the management system. Where all the indications are is that the very popular Annex A, that is the basis, I know, of a lot of people's control selection, is going to be replaced by the new version of 27002, or at least the controls in that. And that, I think, to some degree, talking to some customers, we're seeing a full spectrum of concerns in what that might mean. From a certification point of view, I think we are more than happy to work with clients, customers. I would say right now, think about your risk assessment and risk treatment process under clause 613, and how that is closely linked to your control selection. So just to sort of give a bit of a headline, I think a lot of this information is out in the public domain, but there's been quite a significant reduction, I guess, in the total number of controls, although to some degree there's an element of merging going on. I think it's a reflection of how, as an industry, where we're changing, and perhaps a way in which organisations are dividing themselves in terms of responding to the information security needs of their organisations. So showing focus on the people controls, physical controls, and technological controls. And with all really sitting within that sort of organisational control framework. So one of the interesting things I think that's come about with 27002 is this sort of use of attributes. Wasn't there in the old versions. It's not sure whether it's going to exist in 27001, but I think it gives us a different way of looking at the controls as a way of slicing and dicing. And you can either, so all of the controls in 27002 have now been tagged up, whether they are there primarily to help prevent information security breaches or detect them, correct for them, whether they sit within a defensive domain or resilience domain. And it was interesting, as I say, that business interruption came through is one of the key poll responses. So perhaps searching through 27002, looking at those things that are tagged up as resilience, isn't a bad way to try and strengthen your business posture and reduce that business interruption impact. What I thought would be useful, though, for the purposes of this supply chain discussion, is really picking up that tag the bottom of the fourth column, operational capabilities, and supplier relationship security. And that gives us an opportunity just to sort of cut across those organizational, those technological, and those human factors that I mentioned earlier. And we see really that whilst there is a good cluster within the organizational controls, there's one or two others in section 6, section 8 that are now being sort of pulled into, shall we say, a package of controls that you can consider when helping you to manage the supply chain. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. I'll just sort of pick out 2 or 3 of them just to give you a flavour for what's in there, and the sorts of things that you can think about. But as I say, I think this is one of the positives coming out of 27002, this way of looking across the standard from a different perspective, and certainly from an auditor's point of view. I think that's going to be really interesting in who we meet, because often we talk to people about their roles, their responsibilities. If we can associate that in some way with the tagging, perhaps that will lead to a richer and wider conversation about how they're implementing those responsibilities. So just looking at information security and supplier relationships, and this is certainly not everything, but wanting to make sure that we have an agreed level of security in the supplier relationships. That is a known way of working with your suppliers, making sure that there are processes, procedures in place, and that in some way those suppliers are linked to your information security risks, in particular, understanding whether those products, those services either may introduce a risk, or something that needs to be thought about, whether they're perhaps there to help you manage the risk, and perhaps it's a more collaborative relationship. Key to all of this is obviously communication, whether that's communication in the routine or whether that's communication as part of dealing with an incident, understanding who's responsible for what, and making sure there's good communication flows is always going to be helpful in pulling together a good relationship with your supplier. As Nick mentioned earlier, in terms of the evaluation, it's always important to try and break them down into the types of supplier. Those who perhaps need physical access as opposed to those who need logical access, and what is their level of access, and what is it that they're actually providing to you. And I'll go into the ICT service things in a little bit more, but certainly when you're thinking of products, it's keen to understand what level of control that supplier has over their product, perhaps the information held in that product, and how that could be affected should an incident occur. And certainly in my experience, how are you going to respond with the client if an incident occurs? How are you going to respond with the supplier if an incident occurs? We don't want a case of sloping shoulders. We want everyone sort of to pull together at that key time. Obviously, you'll want to establish formal supplier agreements, and 27002 as 27001 lays out some useful guidance on best practice as to what to put into a supplier agreement, starting with a clear description of what the service or what the product is, whether there's any legal or regulatory aspects that are associated with that supplier agreement. Where do you stand in terms of remediation or indemnities? I will highlight again how the supplier will support you with any incident management procedures, potentially notifying you. That's obviously the starting point if they have a problem, and what they should notify you about, and how quickly they should notify you. Training and awareness is always an interesting one. I think we could probably expect our suppliers, certainly if they're 27001 certified, to have information security training and awareness embedded within their organization. But is their training and awareness program similar to your training and awareness program? Do you need them to be aware of policy aspects that you've established, which will be based on your risk appetite as opposed to theirs, and that could be different. And are there any controls that you want to put on your suppliers in terms of their ability to subcontract out? And that's certainly something I would suggest is critical from provision of ICT services, where often supply chains are quite complex. And of course, we mustn't forget the end of contract responsibilities, whether that's the complete end of the service, whether that's handing that service on to another supplier. How do those arrangements work? Have they closed down their full access to your service, to your information? Have they cleared out whatever information they've held or has been shared with them? There's a couple of controls in there around ICT, and one of the new controls is around cloud services. Broadly speaking, I've tried to sort of pull them together here, just to give you a flavour, as I say, about what you might expect to see in 27002 and what you might expect an auditing company to ask about. So making sure we can push as far as we can into the supply chain. I mean, if we're thinking about supply chain in a cloud environment, often that involves not only the sort of the hardware, there's the telecommunications, there's any software components and other services. Perhaps if it's a hosting environment, perhaps they provide first, second, third line support. What access do they have, and is that right, based on their roles, their responsibilities? You know, you might expect first line, perhaps they're just the sort of call handling side of things, very important in terms of getting the information flowing quickly through the system, but probably won't be like third line, who are going to get in there and roll their sleeves up and help you fix the problem. And then, of course, you know, Internet of Things is there around us, and do we need to think about the device manufacturers, the cloud suppliers, the development of the mobile or the web apps that give you that access? So these supply chains can obviously quickly get complicated, and who you're dealing with and how you're dealing with them is key. Also, you know, we need to think about the validity of the components that you're dealing with. Are they the genuine article? And Nick sort of alluded to ways in which you know, those with devious intent have managed to sort of insert a product or a component into the supply chain. So making sure that you can genuinely understand what products, what components you've got, and their change processes, so that you're aware of when those changes take place, the implications of that, and how those components behave in the event of non-function. You know, they're not doing what they were intended to do. That doesn't necessarily being a bad thing, but at least it needs to be a known situation, so that you can handle that. And the last thing, and certainly relevant to the cloud services, is often these days you buy the service, you don't get much chance to negotiate. That said, a lot of cloud service providers offer a wide range of security services within the actual delivery service, where you can control who has access, you can control configuration, you control all sorts of things. But these are things that are provided to you, and often predefined and not open to negotiation. In my experience as an auditor, that always gives us the chance to discuss, well, what have you got by way of local mitigations and local resources? And so if 27002 wasn't enough for you, and you need more information, then there is 4 additional standards, or a series of 4 additional standards under 27036, which are a little bit older, go back to sort of 2016, but still have a lot of good practice in them. And certainly, if you look at that from a cloud provider, really starts to emphasize how you should think of yourselves as sort of partnerships and in working with the cloud provider, and what that means, whether you're on the acquirer or the supplier side, what that means for the products or services within that cloud environment, and understanding the sort of complexities of the cloud service. But there's always some more information to go to if you want to dig in deeper. So I will hand back to Benjamin and say thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Rob. Again, a fantastic presentation. Really looking forward to nailing down some of these points during the Q&A. Again, we have polls running, and I want to get the results of the poll that I launched just before that presentation. As a quick reminder, the question is, what's the biggest challenge in setting a supply chain agreement? And some very interesting results, actually. So 46%, so nearly half, have gone with A, defining suitable level of detail. 12% of you have gone with B, understanding access requirements. 14% C, understanding resilience of requirements. 4% have picked understanding incident reporting requirements, and 21% of you have gone with agreeing audit/monitoring requirements. I want to get the last poll live, so that'll be running in the background during the imminent Q&A, which will start shortly. And that question is, which of the following is the biggest priority for your organization over the next 12 months? So we have ISO 27001 certification, ISO 27001 training, Cyber Essentials/Cyber Essentials Plus, NIST CSF gap analysis, and incident response workshop. So that is now live. Do get voting. So what I'll do at this stage is I'm going to pull down the slideshow and get us all on full screen. Like this. Fantastic. And I want to start with some start the Q&A. I want to throw a question to our panel. So I think one of the perhaps most pressing questions the audience will be thinking would be, what are some of the major risks that organizations typically face in their supply chain? Could I go to you first, Christian, please, with that question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Benjamin. I think the biggest risk the organisation faces, I guess, is around its decisional response about what it's actually going to do in this space. I mean, supply chain risk management is a real kind of pain in the proverbial, because you're busy here trying to deal with your own security practices, your controls, and making sure you're protecting the organisation. And now all of a sudden you've got to go and worry about another organisation's security to doing the same, when you've probably not got your own fixed and your own house in order. So I think that's probably the first organizational risk that needs to be kind of dealt with, is actually what's the level of response here? What's the appetite? Leading to some of the kind of next points around the kind of level of access, or determining the risk appetite as to what a proportionate response is going to be. Because ultimately, yes, you've got kind of a cyber resilience that you need to kind of demonstrate, and any kind of regulator or legal professional will tell you kind of the importance of contracts and supply chain due diligence. But equally, mixed up in a world where it's not just security that's being asked and managed across the supply chain, your organization is also going to be following up on ESG, the environmental, societal and sort of governance inquiries. D&I might be a big focus. If it's not, it should be in your supply chain, as well as kind of the more traditional financial stabilities, the abilities to kind of provide services, client references, etc. So the sort of supply chain risk component actually includes a lot of other things, not just security. So the biggest challenge there is actually working out how you're going to fit that security approach in with everything else. And I think my esteemed colleagues referenced about kind of the organization assessing other components, and it's important that they get all aligned.
Curious to know what you, Rob, or Nick think as well on that question.
Yeah, I think when you kind of look at the supply chain risk, and I think there are some companies, just not really repeating Christian's point, but there are some companies where everything is outsourced and there isn't much in-house. And I think there really is a balance between what is it that you do in-house and what is it that you outsource. And I think a classic case is most people use Microsoft 365 or Google Docs. Good luck if you send them a questionnaire and get a response back. But essentially, they are almost seen as a kind of, if they go down, the whole world goes down with it. So, really the really high risk suppliers are ones that may be an SME who use a particularly niche piece of software, who might be using personal data or financial data or whatever. Those are inherently the riskiest ones. Where a lot of people do is, well, what's your most critical tool? Well, it's Microsoft. Yeah, well, if Microsoft 365 goes down, then we're all in trouble.
I mean, one of the things I pick up on Christian's point is also about risk ownership. Often there isn't really a single point of ownership when it comes to the supply chain. Different suppliers are supporting different parts of the business. So at one level, perhaps from an operational level, the risk is owned by maybe the facilities manager when it comes to physical, or whether it's software, it's owned by ICT. Typically, most things come back to the procurement department, who are going through the practical evaluation process. So trying to bring those three parties together, I often find quite difficult from an audit point of view. So I don't know how easy it is from an organisational point of view internally. So that's one of the things I thought was nice about the new tagging system in 27002. Perhaps it's a good way of bringing different parts of the organisation together to own the risk. Ultimately, we want our leaders to own risks, but it can quickly split between departments, and I think that can pose a bit of a challenge in terms of getting the right balance.
Fantastic, and thanks so much for all of you for delineating those major risks. I'm wondering what would be the main obstacles that organizations face when trying to manage those risks? Rob, can I go to you first for that question, please?
Yeah, I suppose to some degree, I pick up the point that I just made. We're all people. We all got busy jobs. How efficient and how effectively can we come together to look at a supply chain? We all have different views on those suppliers, and so I think being clear about what is critical about the supply chain is going to differ from person to person, and that in a sense presents an obstacle. That said, let's look at the other end of things, and how easy is it to monitor the performance of the supplier? And Nick made the point that with some of these big suppliers, you get told what you get told, and you've got to deal with that. So that can be really quite hard to communicate in an effective way. But I'm sure my colleagues will have their own views as well.
I'm curious, Nick or Christian, what your thoughts are?
So I think if you're setting out to build the kind of process around supply chain risk management, and you kind of don't know where to start or indeed what's ahead of you, follow the money. So who's buying this sort of stuff, and finding out who's either instigating the purchase or signing off on the invoices is normally a good indicator of who's ultimately going to own the risks associated with them. And if you don't have a central procurement team or a capability that monitors third parties or know who you've got or where they are, normally finance is a good place to start, because everyone's going to need to get paid. Once you've got that, you can start then to classify your vendors. Nick touched on it in his presentation, and I'm sure it features as an area in the kind of revised standards, that you kind of need to kind of work out who's critical, who's not. If Office 365 goes down, as an example, it's going to have a big impact in your organization. If the sandwich vendor doesn't deliver on a Wednesday like they've been doing for the last 3 years, it's not going to be the end of the world, but you'll probably get through it. And look at the dependencies into your other processes and practices to work out how important they are. So if they do go offline for a period of time, understanding the tolerable time of disruption and how and quickly are they going to get back up and running, and to what point are they going to recover to. All of these kind of business continuity type questions are important questions to kind of feature into the discussion with your supply chain.
I should, of course, or pick up on the good old sandwich vendor. Do you know who the sandwich vendor is?
I don't care. I don't care. Well, they don't have physical access. They don't have logical access. But yeah, you're right. You kind of
they might have physical access.
Yeah.
They might get inside the boundary and if they change, it's like the cleaners. If they're wandering around, what can they leave behind? But I take your point on the scale.
Yeah.
And just to top off on that, obviously you there's no central procurement process. You kind of knock on the door of the head of finance, who maybe look at the bank statement, see how much has been spent on the vendor. But I think also another good one is kind of look at who's got service accounts and who's got admin accounts. That's another, at the end of the day, if you've got a supplier who's got access to your crown jewels in terms of elevated privileges, that again is a really high critical one. Maybe the sandwich vendor has some very advanced ordering system that requires admin access. Highly unlikely, but then again, you could have that small supplier that has that admin access because they require persistent access. So I would say not only kind of learn some accounting skills, but also have a really good look at the admin list on your Active Directory as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those great points. So again, I think these are really, really depth points. And I'm wondering, also one of the questions that we have from the audience here is around monitoring. So I want to ask, what's the best approach for organizations to monitor, identify, assess, and mitigate third-party risks? Quite a question there. So Nick, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question, and quite frankly, I could probably bore everyone to death for 3 hours on this, but I'm not. So that's probably quite a good thing. I think really what a lot of people do is they say, it's the realpolitik of it. You don't want to kind of. I think someone's put in a questionnaire. It's like, I don't want to look at 200 questions. I don't want to ask 200 questions. I just want to know, are they safe or are they not? Someone's put about black kite cybersecurity rating. I haven't seen that before, but there is no kind of like BS standard mark of this guy's safe, this guy's not safe. Probably the closest you're going to get to that is some form of company certification, but I think it goes to Christian's point. It is just having an ISO certificate really going to deal with kind of just-in-time day-to-day security operations. There are a lot of these portals that can do active scanning of websites, domains, reputation, and all that kind of thing. And they are a useful indicator, but they are not the be-all and end-all of how healthy a supplier is. Obviously, if you wake up and you're on the train, you read the morning paper, and your key suppliers had a massive breach, that's probably a bit late in knowing about it. But again, it goes back to how available or resilient you want your supply and how critical your supplier is. So there is no real hard and fast rule. I suppose you could be really lazy and say, if all my suppliers have got an ISO 27001 certificate, they've got PCI DSS, they've got some form of kind of external audit, then I'll accept the risk. But the irony is, if you think of Microsoft and Google and Amazon, they've got pages and reams and certificates in every single country, type of business, whatever. We just assume they're safe. They're almost kind of too big to be risky. But then again, they could be the biggest risk to your business.
But equally, they won't engage with you because they see themselves as that big. Here's all the information you need, which can be challenging. Whereas other organisations will present to you all the certificates under the sun, and you then get clients that go, yeah, that's great, but we still want to ask you these questions. I think the issue the industry has is that kind of TPRM, as it's often referred to, the third-party risk management, is almost a cottage industry in itself, as Nick alluded to. There's hundreds of, if not thousands, of different systems and capabilities and platforms, and kind of people always trying to solve a different dynamic to this. And as an end user, as a kind of somebody in that supply chain of quite critical business, it can be really painful because you get clients asking you in platforms that they never use the same one, or they try and aggregate some of the data. So you're then trying to respond in different formats, which are predominantly the same question. But more often than not, a lot of the certifications we carry and sort of peers do also, whether it be ISO related, PCI, Cyber Essentials, or anything further afield. That's almost the sales tool to get you through the door. And then they've got their own set of questions that they want to kind of drill down on you for, which can just really kind of frustrate the security professionals involved, because it's just like, as one of the comments is, not just another 200 questionnaire. We peaked actually last week. We got 947 from one particular client. But yeah, it's painful. The process at the moment is sad because there's no standard industry kind of framework or kite mark has been alluded to. And I guess even if there was, I mean, you'd argue we'd probably got it with ISO, but clients, because of their own risk profiles, they want to ask the particular niche questions or ask it in a way that fits their pro forma and their systems. So we're constantly jumping through hoops for this. I think the challenge is trying to build up that relationship, that actually it's not just I'm firing a questionnaire over to you. With those critical suppliers that you've assessed and classified, I think it's important to build and maintain a regular dialogue on things you're worried about. And those things you're worried about will come from your own risk registers. They might come from industry reports like the Verizon data breach piece, which focuses around probably a handful of controls that have caused or failed as a result of the last kind of breaches in the last 12 months. So maybe they're the questions you're asking about MFA, application access, system admin control, as opposed to have you got a clear desk policy or kind of how do you manage some of the physical security controls? Because let's be honest, a lot of the cyber attacks that we've read about over the many years, they haven't necessarily resulted in a walking through the front door and somebody's kind of plugged into the printer and exfiltrated a load of data. They've come in through phishing or kind of other electronic means over the wire. So that's where the focus, I think, needs to be. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
Rob, do you have a comment on that point?
No, I don't think I've got much to add. I think to some degree, I agree with Christian that the strength of this thing is in the reflection of the risk appetite of the person posing the questions, and therefore building a relationship is going to be better than filling in a form. Ultimately, as I said, if you're going to have to come together to deal with an incident, you're not going to fill a checklist in at that time. You want the relationship to be strong. So,
in my experience, the checklists are useful. The questionnaires are useful when the kind of the dust has settled, the regulators are knocking, law enforcement's knocking, your insurers are asking for evidence that you've done that, or as part of the legal process, you need to evidence that you've taken due care and attention. So that's where that process tends to stand up. A lot of the time, it can tend to just get lost in administration, which is where the burden, I think, is felt with a lot of security teams.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those answers. I have one question here, and I think this will probably answer quite a lot of the questions actually that we've been receiving from our audience. My question is, what are the ISO 27002 changes, and what do these mean for ISO 27001 and organizations ISMS? I know, of course, this was discussed in the opening presentations, but I'm hoping we can kind of drill down on that point a little more. Rob, can I go to you first for that question?
I'm so glad you went there, because I'm thinking I've got no idea. I'm waiting for Rob to step in and save the day.
Well, I'm not that nerdy that I'm going to know them inside out, but there's 11 new controls. I think, as I said before, the 3 of them relate to the organisation. And somebody was asking about what's one of the best ones, and I think there's one about threat intelligence. I think that the more people understand about what the threats, the better. I don't know whether I've made that my best one, but I think it's a really good one. So there's a little change on physical security, perhaps a little bit more on monitoring. I'm not sure that'll make a massive difference in all organisations, and certainly working from home a lot more. But the whole aspect around physical security is changed substantially. And then there's what, off the top of my mouth, seven new controls around the technology, which I think is just a modernisation, bringing us all up to speed. I mean, it's been about 10 years since 27001 was originally published. Good though it is, it did need a bit of refresh. So more about data leakage, web filtering, secure coding. These are new controls that are going to challenge us. In terms of what it means to people with existing systems, I tried to sort of allude to that in my presentation. I think some people find it quite scary. They're thinking, well, I've built my whole statement of applicability, my whole control set around Annex A, and fair enough, we will test that and ask people whether their justification for selection or non-selection. But I would hope that any good risk management system is continually monitoring best practice out there, and continually reflecting that in their choice of risk treatment, and comparing it back to the best practice of 27002. So for me, whilst I don't doubt that it's going to be quite a bit of effort for some organisations, certainly if you purchased a tool that's designed and built around the 27001 control set, that could be quite a challenge. But for most people, I would hope that it would be a natural process to sort of start building that in. And I think one of the questions was, should we move to the new 27002 now? In a way, I'd say yes, but in a controlled way. You know, don't rush to swap everything out and swap everything in. Phase it in. Look at the best practice and start building it into your system now. Perhaps that's hopefully given my colleagues a moment just to think and whether they want to respond further.
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, when 2005 became 2013 and now it became 2022, 2005 dropped quite a lot of the business continuity elements, but then it added in stuff in project management, and then it added in stuff in mobile phone kind of policy as well. I think the move to threat intelligence and monitoring is really key, especially if you've seen a lot more kind of move to cloud-based systems and home-based systems. You talk. I say talk a lot about documented operating procedures, but for InfoSec people like myself, it's all very well having a policy and a procedure, but how do you manage the day-to-day? How do you kind of manage the fluctuations in your network? How do you detect that malware? How do you spot that phishing email? And I think the new ISO goes a long way in kind of doing much less of the monthly security working group meetings and much more of the operational stuff, which I think is a good step.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your responses, everybody.
I mean, one last point I'll just make
sure.
a practical one. I mean, if the standard is published later this year, then I think we would all accreditation bodies would be looking at a 3-year transition period. Probably early adopters, will get a chance in 2023, but those who need a little bit more time may well have out till 2025 to sort things out.
Fantastic. I'm aware of the fact that we're running out of time, and I do want to get the results from that final poll that I launched. So that question is, which of the following is the biggest priority for your organization over the next 12 months? Now, the majority of you have gone with A, ISO 27001 certification. 9% of you have gone with B, so that's training. C, we've got 14%, so Cyber Essentials / Cyber Essentials Plus. 26% have gone with NIST or NIST CSF gap analysis, and 12% of you have gone with incident response workshop. So thank you so much for all your responses. Given that we have just around 2 minutes or so left, the final question I want to raise is, what should organizations consider when choosing a supply chain security? Christian, can I go to you first with that question, please?
Is that considering a supply chain risk vendor or just considering supply chain risk as a whole?
Risk as a whole.
Okay. I think, as with most kind of security responses, is to sort of understand your appetite for risk in this particular area. You're not going to be able to boil the ocean, and I'm sure there'll be vendors out there that can sell you every solution under the sun. And you need to kind of balance the time it's going to take you to build out and develop and run these processes against the day job. And as I sort of mentioned in my opening kind of segment, you're trying to focus on protecting your organization, and now all of a sudden got to worry about the security of others. So it's finding that right balance to ensure that you're not doing too much in either direction. And there's plenty of kind of resources out there to help kind of focus the steps of which you need to kind of go through. So I think for me, it's got to be kind of appetite for level of response.
Fantastic. Nick and Rob, what are your thoughts?
I would say is, and I feel commiserations there, Christian. 947 questions must be making you quite tear to broken glass.
That's a career highlight. It's a career highlight.
It's a career highlight, and I think to me, if me being a kind of virtual CISO, why would you send 947 questions? I mean, ISO is 114, PCI has 460. You know, at the end of the day, if you're looking at your supply chain, you want to understand the risk, the vulnerabilities, and the resilience of your supplier. And if you're having to ask 947 questions, and apologies to that person that wrote the questionnaire, the question I would ask is, what are you trying to achieve, and what answers are you looking for? Is this a kind of horse race contest, or is this really understanding the risk in your supply chain?
And I just like to agree with Christian in terms of getting the risk appetite right for your organization, reflecting that in your supply chain. Maybe there's something in there about understanding the complexity of the supply chain. I don't know how much you can know about that in reality, but asking the question can lead you to have confidence, or possibly ask further questions to drill into that supply chain. If it's a bit cloudy, shall we say, and a bit vague, then perhaps you do need to drill in a little bit deeper.
Fantastic. Okay, so we'll end on that point. I want to say a big thank you again to LRQA for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you for your open presentations, Nick and Rob, and thanks, of course, Christian, for joining and providing such great points. Thank you so much for all the questions. Apologies for that we weren't able to get through all the questions. We had a huge number, but hopefully our speakers have done a pretty good job at answering them. And of course, thank you for all the votes. This webinar will actually be on demand, so feel free to send it to your friends, family, colleagues. But at this point, the webinar will now end. Thank you so much, everybody, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.